And now we return to the question and answer segment of the program. You're listening to independent scholar and author Norman Finkelstein.
Okay, I'm happy to hear not just questions, but I went through a history which some people in the room have lived through, so you can give your own impressions where you think I got it right and where you think I got it wrong. I'd be happy to hear from everybody. Let's start with you.
The first question from the audience was about United States financial support for Israel. This member of the audience believes that U.S. support for Israel is largely due to American Jewish influence over U.S. policy. If support for Israel is declining within the American Jewish community, when will that decline in support be reflected in a corresponding decline in U.S. financial support for Israel?
Well, Israel does serve a function, in my opinion, still serves a function as a strategic asset for the United States, and consequently, it gets lots of money for performing that function. It's also true to say, in my view, if you read the Mearsheimer-Walt book, and you read the chapter on the kinds of money that Israel gets, it's out of sync with any kind of rational explanation. It's got to be the lobby. The lobby explains a significant part of that. When will things change? I think that it's still, the phenomena I'm describing, it's still at its sort of popular level. It's not yet been translated into political action. We haven't yet, you see the disaffection, but disaffection obviously is not enough. The disaffection has to be translated into political organization where you start imposing your will on the political process. And we're not yet there. There'll probably be tendencies now to put a brake on the phenomena I just described. So there's a new organization, as I'm sure you know, J Street, the counterpart to AIPAC. I'm a little bit wary of J Street. I'm not sure it's designed to really mobilize support for a settlement, or it's designed to deflect, to divert people's attention, divert people's energies in another dead end. But as a whole, we still have our work cut out for us. We still have to create political organizations which will channel the kinds of disaffection into meaningful, and that hasn't yet begun, But I think we're getting there. It's I could see, I've been doing a lot of speaking this past year, and it's very clear that people are much better organized than ever before. I just came back from Canada. They have a group, Canadians for Peace and Justice in the Middle East, CPJME, and they said, okay, we scheduled an event for Saturday afternoon. It was gray, it was rainy. I thought to myself, who the hell is going to turn up for this Saturday afternoon in Montreal? And it was 350 people, because they're very good organizers. And everywhere I went, it was over 300 people. Yesterday I spoke in Tucson. It was 500. Yesterday I spoke in Irvine. It was 550 people. And it's not your hardcore leftists, not that any of them still exist, and if they do, they belong in a mental ward. It's, pretty conventional people. You could see there's, the other side is completely isolated now. So at a person-for-person level, I think we're doing well. But there's still, it's a race against time. What can you say? For the Palestinians in Gaza, it's gone from a barbaric occupation to one that's becoming literally unlivable. So whether we have enough time, I don't know. But I think there's every reason to be hopeful about where the trends are. That's for sure. Yes?
The next question for Dr. Finkelstein asked about his earlier admiration of Mao Zedong. Wasn't that admiration at odds with his commitment to human rights?
Well, hope springs eternal. Yeah, that's a biographical question, which should be of no interest to anyone, least of all me. But I can only tell you it was a different era, an era which you couldn't possibly understand because it literally vanished without a trace. But there was a period where people were very hopeful about revolutionary transformation of society. And there were errors made in our assessment. There were errors made in mine because I was young and I couldn't quite understand that people could subordinate ideals to power, just the thirst for power. And so you read stories like Mao Zedong, they go on a long march, 6,000 miles. And I thought, nobody goes on a march for 6,000 miles just for power. You do it for an ideal. And it took me, a while to get older and to realize how corrupting power can be and how corrupting privilege can be. And it's very hard to be aware of that and not become cynical. And I refuse to be cynical. But I think it's a real struggle when you see people close up, even people who espouse the greatest of ideals. It's often not a very pretty picture. That's why I told the fellow over there, never have heroes because you'll always be disappointed. That's the best I could tell you, but I can understand why you would find it hard to understand, because that era, you have to remember how radically things changed in just 20 years' time. When I was growing up, China was the cutting edge of world communism, and now it's literally the cutting edge of world capitalism. That's a very big change. The world turned upside down. At any rate, that's what it seems.
The next question referred back to Dr. Finkelstein's comments about the current situation being a race against time. This audience member asks what he thinks will happen when the United States reduces or ends its support for Israel. How will Israel respond?
That's hard to predict, but I think it is correct to say that, as somebody once said to me, an Israeli, I can't remember her name now, but she said, you'd be surprised how quickly people fall into line when you're no longer buttering their bread. And I think, Israelis can strike all of these poses and postures, but when the moment of reckoning comes, and bear in mind, they have no support in the world apart from the U.S. When the moment of reckoning comes, they'll fall into line. I think most of what goes on in Israel deserves, the whole country deserves an Oscar, because it's just one big show. It's all theater. It's all, it's Cecil B. DeMille writ large, and Cecil B. DeMille was already large. You take these things like the Gaza withdrawal, and there's all of this drama, and people are tearing their hearts out, and they're anguished and fighting with the army. It was all sheer nonsense. It was just made for television melodramatics. The Gaza withdrawal could have been done without one tear being shed, one altercation with one soldier. There are 8,000, 6,000, 8,000 settlers in Gaza. There are 2 million Palestinians. Hamas, crazy. All you had to do was tell the Gaza settlers, hey folks, we're pulling out our troops next week. If you want to stay, stay. They'd be out of there very fast. It was all theater. Israel is just, Israel's a country made for TV. It's just a theater. Yes?
The next audience member asked, does Dr. Finkelstein have any hope at all for Barack Obama if he is elected?
No, there's zero. shouldn't have, we shouldn't have illusions about that. Obviously, a political phenomenon occurred surrounding him. A lot of young people have been mobilized. There's hope. And so long as they're mobilized, that's a good thing. But, and it's understandable. I mean, you went through, most of you, your oldest recollections of a president is Reagan, and, that's pretty terrible. And so it's not surprising that young people, being young people, they want ideals. They want something to believe in. In our case, it was Chairman Mao. You want to hope. Hope springs eternal. And so to me, it's a perfectly understandable phenomenon because you're young, 20, 21. Can life be only about money? Now that's so grubby. It's so grubby. It's so uninspiring. Where the most you can do is sit around the table and decide who's earning more. That's just it's not a life worth living. So people want ideals, and Barack Obama was clever enough to tap into that. He's the African-American Kennedy. In Kennedy's day, the big thing was he was the first Roman Catholic president, and whether he can be elected, because the view back then was Catholics' first loyalty was to the Vatican, and so there was a whole issue about electing Kennedy because he's Catholic. And now Barack Obama, he's just a new version of that. It's not a Catholic president, it's an African-American president. The same liberal talk, and, as is obvious, Obama's trying to imitate Kennedy in every possible way, including the most insipid ways, when he was when it was said to Obama that he was giving false hopes. And I remember listening to him say, when we said we were going to land a man on the moon, would Kennedy have said it's not possible? Really, this is just pure crap. So there's no reason to be hopeful. On the other hand, frankly, personally, I'm glad I want the end with Hillary. Hillary is like the American Robert Mugabe. You just can't get her out of office. She makes Mugabe look like milk toast. I'm serious.
What about Putin?
Putin?
Yeah, Putin just stepped down. He's still there.
Yes. Next.
The next audience member said that her interest in the Israel-Palestine conflict comes from her background as a Christian. She said she was neither pro-Palestinian nor pro-Israeli, but that she was pro-truth, pro-information and knowledge, and was trying to understand the United States military presence, political views, and so on. She said that Dr. Finkelstein had not spoken of the spiritual call that Jewish people have to be in the land and why they are called to be there. And in Christian circles of the Presbyterian Church, where this person attends and does Bible studies, she said that older people in their 60s who are scholars, missionaries, people who are engineers, doctors, and physicians, their very strong belief is that the Jews are called to be in the land. She says that this goes back through the history of the Bible, of Abraham, and the covenant that God had with Abraham, and from Abraham to Isaac and Ishmael, and from Isaac and Ishmael to the Jewish tribe and land, and to the Arab tribes. So, she said, from the very beginning of Abraham's descendants, there has been conflict. And then, she said, we come to the modern day, to Hollywood, and a recent movie about Jerusalem, where you learn about Saladin, and the rise and fall of Jerusalem, and how many times it has changed hands between Jewish and Arab peoples of the region. She said she was trying to understand the Jewish-Arab conflict. She found it interesting, not knowing much about either culture, that there were so many similarities between Arabs and Jews. In very many ways, their cultures, their faiths, their beliefs, their customs, their laws, food, holidays, and so on. She asked Dr. Finkelstein, how would you address the spiritual call, the tie that each of these peoples believe they have with the land, and what they believe is the covenant between God and Abraham.
Well, maybe my answer is going to disappoint you, but I don't think that's what politics is about.
Maybe
And what?
not
And
the
what?
politics in Washington.
Yeah, I'm gonna. But
Maybe not the politics in Washington.
yeah, but
politics in Ohio,
but
and Indiana,
yeah, but
or
okay,
beliefs
fair
of the
enough.
common man.
No, that's fair enough. But my point is, once you go in that direction, the conflict becomes unresolvable. That's why when we look for resolutions of conflicts, we look for political principles or legal principles in order to guide us. When the International Court of Justice has to decide to whom does the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem belong, and I'm not meaning this facetiously, I'm meaning it as a factual matter. They don't look into the Bible. They don't look into Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and whoever. That's not, no, there's no reason to applaud because I don't want in any way diminish people's spiritual feelings, and I can understand that. It's not my cup of tea, I happen to be an atheist, but it's, not alien to me, I can understand it. The point is, I don't think as a political issue, that's the way you can resolve these questions. You take the American history of the American South. I'm sure you're aware that a large amount of the rationalization for the enslavement and then the Jim Crow laws against African Americans go back and read because they were descendants of Ham and all the rest. And they found all of these biblical justifications for what they were doing. Now, with the American Supreme Court, is that the standard that they used in Brown versus the Board of Ed? No, obviously you use legal, political criteria in order to resolve the conflict. Because once you go in your direction, it plainly is not resolvable. You start each, it's like anyone in this room. Everyone in this room understands that concept. If I were to walk up and knock on your door, you, and say, according to the Bible in my hand, it so happens that your house is located on a piece of land to which I have deep spiritual ties. So I'm taking your house. Well, what would you say? If you would probably say I should make a beeline for Bellevue, But that's the same principle. It's the same principle. She's going to say, I have legal title to that land. And that legal title takes priority over whatever spiritual links, whatever spiritual claims you may have to it.
And I don't disagree with you. I'm not saying.
As a follow-up, this audience member said that Dr. Finkelstein needed to understand the emotion of the conflict and the faith involved in the conflict. She said, you have Arab terrorists, suicide bombers. She was interrupted by another member of the audience, who said he was not a terrorist, that he was an Arab, but that he was not a terrorist. And he asked that she not say Arab terrorist. He said that such a phrase is insulting his people. My people are loving people. They are nice people. I am one of them, and we don't hurt people. He said that you need to read L'Amitié Judéo-Arabe by Thierry Desjardins, a French journalist. And he said if you read that book, you will understand. People often talk about Christian Judeo-civilization, but they always ignore what became of Judeo-Arab civilization. Judeo-Arab friendship, when the Jews were protected by Muslims from the Inquisition and the torture and the killing. That's why they fled to North Africa. They didn't go north. This audience member said that Arabs protected the Jews until the ends of the earth. We, the Arabs, he said. We protected them from the Americans, from the Germans. My parents died in Algeria to protect the French and the Jews, he said.
Can we get another question?
Okay, go ahead, sir.
The next question asks about the political rise of Zionism and its usefulness in the United States. I wonder if there is a different reason for the rise of Christian Zionism. Or was it that Christian Zionism arose at the same time as Jewish Zionism in the United States?
I'll tell you the truth, I don't know much. I've read on the topic, but I can't really speak to its origins. Personally, I think that there's a certain amount of exaggeration about this Christian Zionism claim. It's true that there's a lot of crazy Christians, Zionists, who believe in all sorts of weird things like rapture and whatever else, and there's a lot of people out there who believe that. There's no question. But if you look at the Christian Zionist political agenda, Israel's not high on the agenda. It's mostly social issues. It's abortion, gay marriage, things like that. Israel is an item. But it's not an item on which, for example, Christian Zionists vote or don't vote you up or vote you down. The agenda is a pretty narrowly social agenda and not a political one. That's my impression. I think there's been a certain amount of exaggeration about the Christian Zionism in order to pretend that the Israel lobby is not just Jewish. No, it is fundamentally Jewish. Yes.
The next comment from a member of the audience was that he was impressed with Dr. Finkelstein's ability to speak on behalf of the Jewish people.
I'm not speaking on behalf of the Jewish people, and I would never claim to. I wasn't asked to represent the Jewish people. I was asked to represent my own opinion on the topic, presumably a scholarly one based on my study. So I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to, first of all, I don't even know what this concept of the Jewish people means, and even if I knew exactly what it meant, I would never be so presumptuous as to speak on behalf of any people. I'm not an elected officer of any organization, let alone a representative of an entire people. And if that was your apprehension, then I certainly would want to dispel that. I don't think the fact that I was Jewish ever even arose. Maybe I've forgotten because I'm tired. But I don't think it ever even came up. So I'm not sure why you're imputing that.
This audience member followed up by saying that Dr. Finkelstein was representing the beliefs of American Jews and Israeli Jews.
Yeah, I wasn't representing, I was telling you what the poll data showed, what the scholarly record shows. If I were to come before you now and give a lecture on for example, what poll data, what scholarly record has to show on Chinese attitudes towards Tibet, would you say I was representing the Chinese people? I think that would be a silly inference. Then why do you infer from the fact that I tried to convey some scholarly material on the record of American Jewry that I came here to represent the Jewish people? I don't see the basis for that claim, other than to be a cheap shot, and it was cheap. Yes?
The next member of the audience talked about the suggestion that U.S. geopolitical policy, especially in the Middle East, is one of the driving reasons that Israel has never been able to make peace with its neighbors, that even if Israel wanted to, that U.S. influence would halt that from happening, to keep Israel dependent on the United States, that Israel as a state is kept as our watchdog there. What are your thoughts about this view of the relationship between the United States and Israel?
I think that's a little bit Machiavellian. I think Israel has its own interests and has historically had its own interests in the region, and those interests have historically converged very self-consciously on the Israeli part with those of the Western powers. Israel, after all, was fundamentally a creation of the West. It was unthinkable that Israel could have emerged were it not for first the British, the Balfour Declaration and then the British Mandate. And then subsequently, during the 1950s, it was closely allied with the Western powers, notably France, after 1967, the United States. And there's been a convergence of interest between the two. Namely, Israel always saw itself as an outpost of the West in the Arab world. Israel has never considered itself an Arab country. It's always considered itself a Western country, as they like to say, a Judeo-Christian country. That's the nowadays.
So more a marriage of convenience than
I think it's convergence and this notion that, for example, it is true that the U.S. has a stake in maintaining the conflict between Israel and the Arab world, and I wouldn't want to gainsay that. But I think there's a certain element of you ascribe an element of Machiavellianism which doesn't exist when you say the whole conflict between Israel and the Arabs is due to the United States. No, it's not the whole conflict. There's a convergence of interest between the U.S. and Israel. You take the case of the last war, the July-August 2006 war. Israel wanted to inflict a devastating defeat on the Hezbollah because of the Hezbollah's victory in May 2000 when it expelled the Israeli army. Israel also wanted to inflict a defeat on Hezbollah to pave the way for an attack on Iran. The United States also wanted to inflict a defeat on Hezbollah to pave the way for an attack on Iran. So you had a convergence of interest between the United States and Israel, with Israel doing the actual killing and the United States acting as the defense guard, preventing the implementation of a United Nations resolution. But that was not, as in my opinion, the unsupportable claims of Walter Mearsheimer that the July 2006 war was an Israeli war and the lobby forced the United States against its will to support the Israeli attack. There's no evidence for that. The United States was very thrilled by the prospect of Israel knocking out the Hezbollah for its own interests. So I think it's a convergence, generally speaking, though it is true to say that the U.S. would prefer an Israel at war with the Arab world than Israel at peace with the Arab world, because were Israel to be at peace, there's the possibility, in my opinion, probably quite small, but there's the possibility that Israel will become integrated with the Arab world, in which case the United States won't have an outpost there. Yes?
The next question asked if Dr. Finkelstein had any information on possible challenges on a legal basis of U.S. support for Israel, since there is strong evidence of human rights violations by the State of Israel, and since there are restrictions that prevents the United States from providing foreign aid to a country that commits crimes against international law. What are the prospects of using a legal challenge to stop U.S. aid to Israel?
Well, there are, many opportunities. All you have to do is read the human rights reports, and Israel has made massive misuse, illegal use of weapons that the United States has supplied to Israel. So there is American law. You take the case, for example, of the July-August 2006 war. Israel dropped, it's unprecedented in the history of the world, Israel dropped 4.6 million cluster bomblets on Lebanon. It was the densest use of cluster bomblets in the history of the world. The only thing that came close to it was 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, during the attack on Iraq. The U.S. dropped about 20 million cluster bombs, but it was over an area which was 20 times the size. If you read the actual reports on what Israel did, it was almost out of a science fiction movie, where entire villages, roofs, rooms, everything was just saturated with these cluster bomblets. And that was illegal the way it was done, because it was done indiscriminately on civilian areas. It was illegal under international law. A large number of those bombs, or cluster bomblets, were supplied by the United States. So there is legal grounds. The obvious question is, where do you channel your energy? What's the most likely place to produce results? There is a legal case there, but that may not be, I don't know, that may not be the best place to channel your energies. Yes?
The next question for Dr. Finkelstein asked about the significance of the birthright program.
Yeah, well, actually, a lot is written on that because there was the Birthright Israel program, sending over Jews for free who are of college age. It was initiated because of the polls that were showing the American Jewish youth are, again, to use the technical term, distancing themselves from Israel. And my own view is it's very unlikely to have any long-term effects, maybe for 3 months. And then after 3 months, it's just like with that fellow who began the program. He starts repeating the statistics, what happened last week, X number of homes demolished, X number of people killed, X number of people imprisoned. The effects of the Birthright Israel begin to wear away very quickly in the face of a reality which is simply irreconcilable with any liberal minimal notion of what's just and what's right.
We need to begin wrapping up, so just a
Yes.
few questions.
Yeah.
The next comment from the audience referred back to the earlier discussion of the role of faith and history in the conflict. This person said he was Palestinian. He said he was shocked at how many people in the United States believe that the conflict is religious and historical. He argued that it is not historical and not religious at all. There is no historic or religious animosity towards the Jews, he said. Jews lived in my city, Hebron, with Arabic names, and lived very normal lives, until the Zionist movement, until the immigration accelerated at the beginning of the 20th century. Then the problem started, he said. Before that, Jews lived in Yemen, Jews lived in Morocco. Until now, Jews live in Iraq. He said that Americans need to rethink their understanding of the historical background of the conflict. Jews and Palestinians, all Muslims, all Arabs, never fought over that land except in this 20th century, he said. Yes, before that, the land moved between the hands of many peoples, from the Romans to the Muslims, back to the Romans, back to the Muslims. The British came, and then the Turks, and the British came again. It seems like when you study the history of the Bible, that it starts 3,000 years before. There's a gap, nothing, and then today. I think that more education is needed to understand the history of this region. The next member of the audience asked Dr. Finkelstein to explain why, if there was a deliberate policy of expulsion, of ethnic cleansing, why then are there so many Palestinians remaining in Israel, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, living inside the Green Line, inside the State of Israel?
Abstractly, well, if there was a genocide against the Jews, how did it happen that so many Jews survived the Nazi era? Both can be true. You can have an ethnic cleansing or a genocide, but it may not be 100% efficient in its implementation. In the case of Israel, in each individual case, there was a different explanation. So, for example, the Galilee was overwhelmingly Christian Arab. And the Zionist movement was very fearful of offending the Vatican in 1948. So when it came to expulsions, they did not expel the Christian Arabs. And by the way, that's the clearest evidence that there was a systematic plan to expel. Because were it simply an accident of war, you couldn't explain why the Christian Arabs remained in place, but the Muslim Arabs were the ones that were expelled. The only way you can explain that differentiation is if there were, in advance, a plan to keep some, expel the others. Then you can have places like Haifa, which were mixed Arab-Jewish towns, and where they needed Arabs to continue to do work. That they couldn't take over all of the labor that the Arabs had performed, and so Arabs were allowed to stay in Haifa. They were moved downtown and then shifted around. but in each individual case. But what's more remarkable is not how many remained, but how efficient the ethnic cleansing was. You know, the estimate is about 80% of the 80% of the Arabs from Palestinian Arabs.
What period of time did that take?
Usually the dating begins November 1947. The main bulk begins April 1948 with the expulsion in Haifa, and it goes from April 1948 up until the end of 1948, where the real brutal expulsions occur, which is in months like October, because it's at that point that the Palestinians realize if they leave their home, they're not coming back. And so they were much more difficult to get rid of. In the early months, a lot of people fled, from fear. But then it became apparent, especially after June 1948, when Israel implemented its policy of demolishing the villages, that you were not going to come back. And so beginning around in the months like October and November, that's when the large-scale massacres begin, because the Arabs didn't want to leave. And it's over by about, the fighting ends January 1949.
The next question is about reparations for Holocaust survivors. Can you talk about the research that you did in writing your book, The Holocaust Industry?
When I first wrote on the topic in 2000, The Holocaust Industry, the part of the book which generated the most attacks on me was that I said that the Holocaust had become a shakedown racket to extract compensation monies in the name of what were called needy Holocaust victims. And the last chapter of that book was called The Double Shakedown, because I said it was a fraud on two counts. Number one, the claims that were being made against places like the Swiss about them having billions of dollars in Jewish accounts was completely fraudulent, easy enough to demonstrate. And number two, the claim that was being made that they were collecting all this money for needy Holocaust victims was, of course, completely fraudulent also. They were collecting the money for their pockets and for their organizations. But now those claims are not controversial at all anymore. You take the case, the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust was the late Raoul Hilberg. And Hilberg, some of you may know, is the author of The Destruction of the European Jews, the 3-volume classic study. And Hilberg came along and he said, well, what Finkelstein wrote is true. He said, I'm quoting him now, I thumbed through the same pages of the same documents as him. And to use his words, he says, it's the first time in history, and now I'm quoting him, that Jews, he didn't say some Jews, he said Jews are making use of the blackmail weapon. And he said these numbers that were being conjured up about billions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts, it was totally preposterous. Anyone on a moment's reflection knows it was completely without any basis. Everyone in this room understands it's very simple. Number one, most Jews in Europe were poor. That's why when they made Fiddler on the Roof, they had Tevye say, if I were a rich man, if I were a rich man. You start reading the Holocaust industry publications in 1995. Not only was Tevye a rich man, he had a chalet in Switzerland, he had an art collection, he owned a Mercedes. This was nutty. The only ones who believed that Jews were overwhelmingly rich were the Nazis. But Jews lived in their greatest number overwhelmingly. They lived in shtetls in Eastern Europe. They didn't have a nickel or a penny to their name. If I were a rich man. Number two, before the Nazis come to power, you have what's called a depression in Europe. You know what depression means? It means rich people lose all their money. That's what happens when the stock market crashes. So number two, if you had money, the money was gone. That's Black Friday. The stock market crashes. Number three, if you managed to have money despite that, you got out. That's one of the good fortunes of having money. Like the Rothschilds, if you read the story, the Rothschilds were very clever. Whenever the Nazis would move into one country, there were branches of the Rothschilds in every country. They would move their money. They would stay one ahead. So if the Nazis went into one country, the Rothschilds have the money in another country, and what did they do? They were good brothers. They cared about their siblings. They bought them out. And if they got out, and that's one of the good fortunes of being rich, after the war, they went to the Swiss banks and took out their money. So when you add up the three factors, one, Jews are overwhelmingly poor. Two, those who had money lost it in the Depression. And three, if they managed to salvage it, they just after the war, they withdrew it. There couldn't have been billions of dollars in the Swiss banks. It's completely nutty. I have a brother, he's a millionaire. He doesn't have a Swiss bank account. I'm serious. How many of you have Swiss bank accounts? How many of your parents have Swiss bank accounts? So why do you think somebody in some shtetl in Poland is having a Swiss bank account? It's nutty. And as I said, it's no longer controversial that the whole thing was a fake. The needy Holocaust victims, the whole thing was complete Holocaust denial in the most literal sense of the word. What was the Nazi Holocaust? It was the systematic, assembly line, methodical extermination of the Jews. And you know what made it so unique to the extent that it was? It was very efficient. They killed everybody. If you survived, it was really just a fluke of good fortune. A handful survived. May 1945, the numbers are 100,000 at most. 100,000 Jews survived the death camps, the labor camps, and the ghettos. At most, 100,000 survived. By 1996, when this whole Holocaust industry starts up, the compensation claims for needy Holocaust victims, how many can be around? Do the arithmetic. 20,000? 10,000? Both of my parents were in the Nazi concentration camps. Both of them were Majdanek. My father was in Auschwitz. My mother then was in 2 slave labor camps. My father was in the Auschwitz Death March. By 1995, both of my parents were dead. If you look at my eldest brother, he didn't have a bar mitzvah. My parents were atheists, but they had a celebration. And you look in, and all my parents' friends were either people they knew from before the war or people who they met in the displaced people's camps after the war. They never had any American friends. And you look at the people, Tanya, Lanya, Clara, Yuzik, go through all of them. They're all dead. Now all of a sudden, they're telling you there are hundreds of thousands of survivors. Because the more numbers of survivors, the more money they can ask for, needy Holocaust victims. So they start to inflate the number of survivors. Well, if you start inflating the number of survivors, it's a basic mathematical principle. If you start off with a finite number of people and you inflate the number of survivors, you end up reducing the number of victims. Well, that becomes Holocaust denial. If so many survived, it wasn't very efficient. As my late mother used to say, if everyone who claims to be a Holocaust survivor is one, who did Hitler kill? Everyone says they're a Holocaust survivor. They think it was like, some sort of, Auschwitz was in the Catskills. It was a bungalow colony. The whole thing was totally ridiculous. It was preposterous. It was a disgrace. It's exactly as Hilberg said, a blackmail weapon. That's what the Nazi Holocaust turned into. It's one of the strange phenomena. It turns into a blackmail weapon on the one hand, and now the Nazi Holocaust is the main ideological weapon to mobilize populations for illegal wars of aggression. Iraq is Hitler. If you oppose the attack on Iraq, what did they say? You're appeasers, like the appeasers of Chamberlain, like appeasers like Chamberlain in 38. Now they're saying the same thing with Iran. What's Iran? Iran is Hitler. Ahmadinejad is Hitler. They're all Hitler. And if you oppose a war against them, if you oppose a war, you're an appeaser, like the appeasers of Hitler. And so the Nazi Holocaust, on the one hand, it's a shakedown used for shaking down countries, and on the other hand, it's used to mobilize populations to wage war. It's pitiful. It really is. It's a very sad chapter, I think, in the history of Jews, what they did to the most colossal tragedy. And here I will speak, and I have a right to speak. My parents went through it. To use the most colossal tragedy in the history of the Jews as a huckstering weapon, and to use it to wage war and to kill people. That's horrible.
We can take one final question.
Yeah.
The final question is about bringing a just resolution to this conflict. How do we talk about this issue, this conflict, in a way that is sensitive to the many different values, religious values, that often bear upon how people think about these issues?
I think that's right, and I think people are a mixed bag. All people, the fundamental characteristic of human beings is they're an incoherent whole. Nobody is a uniform whole. And the answer seems to be you have to appeal to certain people's basic values such that they see. Every moral value, its meaning only is if it's applied across the board. And so you have to ask these people, how would you feel if somebody came in and said, according to my Bible, your house is on my land? Would you move? And I think people immediately grasp that there are some basic principles which, when it's applied to them, they recognize there's something wrong with it. Israel is the only country in the world which legalized house demolitions as a form of punishment. So you ask somebody, do you think it's right if somebody in your family did something wrong, they blow up your whole house? Does that sound right? No other country in the world does that. It's not legal anywhere else in the world. The fellow said how many houses were demolished last week?
I think
23 houses demolished. You know what it means to demolish a person's home? For Palestinians, poor people, their only investment in life is their home. Everything is invested in their house. They don't have stocks and bonds. It's their house. And they invest a lot in that house. It's a labor of love to build that home, block by block. And a lot of them, take my best friend Musa, Abu Heshesh, who he knows. Musa's from Fawar Camp. He happens to be located in what's called Area C of the West Bank, which Israel claims control over. Israel doesn't let any Palestinians build any homes in Area C. So you have nowhere to build. And he wants a home for his family. So he built his home on a mountain right outside Fawar Camp. It's illegal. Any day the Israelis can come in and knock it down, as they routinely do. The houses you described are almost certainly administrative or demolitions. There's three kinds of demolitions. There's the demolition as a form of punishment. Secondly, there's the demolitions for allegedly military purposes. We have to clear the area for military purposes, and the other kind, which is the most common now, is the administrative demolitions. They go in, they say, well, your house is illegally built there. Of course it's illegally built because you don't give a permit to let anyone build. They can't build anywhere. And so people have to stand there and just watch everything they invested in life, everything destroyed. I remember during the first Intifada, some of you may remember the scenes where they would just go in and blow up houses. Now they do it more gently with bulldozers. Just blow it up. I remember my friend Musa, it's already 25 years, it's 20 years ago, 22 years ago. It was the first time I went over, and he said, I just can't understand how people can do that. How can you blow up somebody's house? I mean, what kind of level of barbarism is that? Now, I can't see that people won't understand that. Whatever your spiritual, your biblical affections are, I don't see how you cannot understand that. That's just so wrong. And that's what they experience every day. That was 1 week. You know, an Israeli columnist wrote just the past week, he says, well, Israelis, they like to clear their conscience. They talk about all these Israeli children who have been killed. And then the columnist, his name is B. Michael, he says, I have a little information for you. He says, well, since 2004, 11 Israeli children have been killed. And during that same period, since 2004, 432 Palestinian children have been killed. That's the reality. It's so wretched. And I'm not so hopeless on people that whatever their religious feelings, they can't really see that. You know, or most people. There are some, this young man here knows, you go into Hebron, those settlers, no, that's a lost cause. I won't quote Chairman Mao, I'll quote Mr. Trotsky. Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionist, he was once asked, what should you do with fascists? And he replied, acquaint them with the pavement. And there's some truth to that. No, you're not going to change the mind of those settlers in Hebron. Those settlers, they are like from some sort of science fiction movie. They're freaks. But most people you can reach, and I remain perfectly confident. All you have to do is be reasonable. Don't strike radical poses. Don't try to be holier than thou. Don't try to be ideologically pure. This is not an occasion to prove something about yourself. You want to end the occupation. Be reasonable, be fair, of course, be principled. But I think if we rely on elementary principles of, I think you said it, of what's truthful, what's just, I'm perfectly confident that people can understand it and that we can win. And when I say win, I don't mean at anyone's expense. You know, this is not trying to sort of vanquish your enemy. No. You know, the late Edward Said, he used to like to quote this guy, M.A. Cesar, as saying, there's a place for everyone at the rendezvous with victory. And I think that's a nice statement. If you're fair, if you're just, if you're reasonable, there's a place for everyone at the rendezvous with victory. And that's what we're striving for. We're not out to this...
You've been listening to independent scholar and author Norman Finkelstein. The title of this lecture, The Coming Breakup of American Zionism. He spoke at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington on May 8, 2008. For more information about Norman Finkelstein and his work, please visit his website at www.normanfinkelstein.com. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find streaming video and audio programs featuring speakers such as Ralph Nader, Susan Faludi, Noam Chomsky, Phyllis Bennis, Rashid Khalidi, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
It was 350 people, because they're very good organizers. And everywhere I went, it was over 300 people. Yesterday I spoke in Tucson, it was 500. No, yesterday I spoke in Irvine. It was 550 people. And it's not your hardcore leftists, not that any of them still exist, and if they do, they belong in a mental ward. It's, pretty conventional people. You could see there's, the other side is completely isolated now. So at a person-for-person level, I think we're doing well. But there's still, it's a race against time. What can you say? For the Palestinians in Gaza, it's gone from a barbaric occupation to one that's becoming literally unlivable. So whether we have enough time, I don't know. But I think there's every reason to be hopeful about where the trends are. That's for sure. Yes?
The next question for Dr. Finkelstein asked about his earlier admiration of Mao Zedong. Wasn't that admiration at odds with his commitment to human rights?
Well, hope springs eternal. Yeah, that's a biographical question, which should be of no interest to anyone, least of all me. But I can only tell you it was a different era, an era which you couldn't possibly understand because it literally vanished without a trace. But there was a period where people were very hopeful about revolutionary transformation of society. And there were errors made in our assessment. There were errors made in mine because I was young and I couldn't quite money that Israel gets. Yeah, it's out of sync with any kind of rational explanation. It's got to be the lobby. The lobby explains a significant part of that. When will things change? I think that it's still, the phenomena I'm describing, it's still at its sort of popular level. It's not yet been translated into political action. We haven't yet, you see the disaffection, but disaffection obviously is not enough. The disaffection has to be translated into political organization where you start imposing your will on the political process. And we're not yet there. And there'll probably be tendencies now to put a brake on the phenomena I just described. So there's a new organization, as I'm sure you know, J Street, the counterpart to AIPAC. I'm a little bit wary of J Street. I'm not sure it's designed to really mobilize support for a settlement, or it's designed to deflect, to divert people's attention, divert people's energies in another dead end. But as a whole, we still have our work cut out for us. We still have to create political organizations which will channel the kinds of disaffection into meaningful, and that hasn't yet begun, But I think we're getting there. It's I could see, I've been doing a lot of speaking this past year, and it's very clear that people are much better organized than ever before. I just came back from Canada. They have a group, Canadians for Peace and Justice in the Middle East, CPJME, and they said, okay, we scheduled an event for Saturday afternoon. It was gray, it was rainy. I thought to myself, who the hell is going to turn up for this Saturday afternoon in Montreal? And
And now we return to the question and answer segment of the program. You're listening to independent scholar and author Norman Finkelstein.
Okay, I'm happy to hear not just questions, but I went through a history which some people in the room have lived through, so you can give your own impressions where you think I got it right and where you think I got it wrong. I'd be happy to hear from everybody. Let's start with you.
The first question from the audience was about United States financial support for Israel. This member of the audience believes that U.S. support for Israel is largely due to American Jewish influence over U.S. policy. If support for Israel is declining within the American Jewish community, when will that decline in support be reflected in a corresponding decline in U.S. financial support for Israel?
Well, Israel does serve a function, in my opinion, still serves a function as a strategic asset for the United States, and consequently, it gets lots of money for performing that function. It's also true to say, in my view, if you read the Mearsheimer-Walt book, and you read the chapter on the kinds of understand that people could subordinate ideals to power, just the thirst for power. And so you read stories like Mao Zedong, they go on a long march, 6,000 miles. And I thought, nobody goes on a march for 6,000 miles just for power. You do it for an ideal. And it took me, a while to get older and to realize how corrupting power can be and how corrupting privilege can be. And it's very hard to be aware of that and not become cynical. And I refuse to be cynical. But I think it's a real struggle when you see people close up, even people who espouse the greatest of ideals. It's often not a very pretty picture. That's why I told the fellow over there, never have heroes, because you'll always be disappointed. That's the best I could tell you, but I can understand why you would find it hard to understand, because that era, you have to remember how radically things changed in just 20 years' time. When I was growing up, China was the cutting edge of world communism, and now it's literally the cutting edge of world capitalism. That's a very big change. The world turned upside down. At any rate, that's what it seems.
The next question referred back to Dr. Finkelstein's comments about the current situation being a race against time. This audience member asks what he thinks will happen when the United States reduces or ends its support for Israel. How will Israel respond?
That's hard to predict, but I think it is correct to say that, as somebody once said to me, an Israeli, I can't remember her name now, but she said, you'd be surprised how quickly people fall into line when you're no longer buttering their bread. And I think, Israelis can strike all of these poses and postures, but when the moment of reckoning comes, and bear in mind, they have no support in the world apart from the U.S. When the moment of reckoning comes, they'll fall into line. I think most of what goes on in Israel deserves, the whole country deserves an Oscar, because it's just one big show. It's all theater. It's all, it's Cecil B. DeMille writ large, and Cecil B. DeMille was already large. You take these things like the Gaza withdrawal, and there's all of this drama, and people are tearing their hearts out, and they're anguished and fighting with the army. It was all sheer nonsense. It was just made for television melodramatics. The Gaza withdrawal could have been done without one tear being shed, one altercation with one soldier. There are 8,000, 6,000, 8,000 settlers in Gaza. There are 2 million Palestinians. Hamas, crazy. all you had to do was tell the Gaza settlers, hey folks, we're pulling out our troops next week. If you want to stay, stay. They'd be out of there very fast. It was all theater. Israel is just, Israel's a country made for TV. It's just a theater. Yes?
The next audience member asked, does Dr. Finkelstein have any hope at all for Barack Obama if he is elected?